Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you're curious about, the ones you send us, and really try to extract the key insights. It's a way to get informed efficiently.
Hmm.
And today we're diving into Irreecha. That's the Oromo Thanksgiving. A listener flagged this one for us, curious about this particular cultural celebration.
That's right. And we've got a source here that goes into quite a bit of detail. It's celebrated by, well, millions of Oromo people.
Yeah.
Both in Oromia, which is their homeland within Ethiopia, and also in the diaspora around the world, usually in September.
Right, September.
Yeah.
And it's getting more international attention lately, too, which is interesting.
It is. So, yeah, our goal here, our sort of mission for this dive is to explore the history behind it, what it means culturally, what makes Irreecha unique, and maybe get a better understanding of the Oromo people along the way.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start with September.
Yeah.
Why is that month so significant?
Well, the document points out that September is actually the Oromo New Year, and that part's shared with some other groups in Ethiopia. But Irreecha itself, the Thanksgiving part we're focusing on, that's distinctively Oromo. That's the key difference.
And it connects so strongly to nature, doesn't it? The source paints this picture of Oromia, like the rainy season is ending.
Exactly. Flowers are blooming, the rivers are full again. There's this real sense of the land being renewed, rejuvenated.
You can almost feel that connection, the idea of giving thanks for that abundance, for nature coming back to life.
Yeah, and it's not just symbolic. The source links this renewal directly to their worldview, casting the spirit, the land, fertility, sustenance. That's why Irreecha isn't just, say, a harvest festival. It's much broader.
More holistic, maybe.
That's a good word for it, yeah. And practically speaking, the source also mentions, it's a time when farmers get a break after the main agricultural season. Schools reopen around then, too.
Right, so it marks a shift in the natural world and the social calendar. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the historical roots? Oromo identity. The document gets into some interesting areas here.
It does. It presents this academic view of the Oromo as an ancient Cushitic people.
Cushitic. Right, that's a major language group in that whole region, Northeast Africa.
Precisely. And the source even brings up potential connections to the Ethiopians mentioned in the Bible. It really emphasizes this long, deep history in that part of the world.
But then there's the whole thing about the name Ethiopia today, which is used for the modern state that includes many ethnic groups.
Yes, the author points that out. While the name Ethiopia is now widely used for the state, the Oromo have their own distinct historical identity.
And the author contrasts this with claims by some other groups.
It mentions how some Amhara and Tigrayan groups link their ancestry to biblical figures, and the author suggests this might be, well, a more recent development. They even draw a parallel with how Sudanese identity is understood.
It definitely makes you think about how these historical narratives get formed and sometimes contested over time.
Absolutely.
Now, a really big part of the source material is about the Gada system. This sounds pretty remarkable. What exactly was it?
Yeah, the Gada system is described as the Oromo's traditional system of governance. And it was Democratic Republican and apparently functioned until, the late 19th, maybe early 20th century.
Wow.
And the author makes this really interesting comparison, likening it to the ancient Greek city-states.
Yeah.
In terms of its principles, its structure.
A pre-colonial African democracy compared to ancient Greece. That's not a narrative you hear every day. What were its main features?
Okay, so several key things. They had regular elections every 8 years.
8 years.
And elected leaders only served one single 8-year term. No re-elections for that top spot.
Built-in term limits. Way back then, that's quite something.
It really is. The source mentions it was a way to stop power getting too concentrated, keep things fresh. And it featured universal suffrage, at least for Oromo males.
Okay, so who held the power? What were the roles?
Well, the head figure, sort of the president or executive head, was called the Gada.
Gada, got it.
Then there was the Chafi. That was like the Oromo Congress, an assembly with elected representatives from different regions.
Okay, a legislative body.
Exactly. And they had a judiciary, too, headed by the Abasera.
It sounds like a clear separation of powers. The source even mentions checks and balances, like the U.S. system.
Yeah, the author draws that parallel, emphasizing that these different branches, the executive, the legislative, the judicial, had some independence, but were still accountable ultimately to the people who elected them.
Fascinating.
And there were other specific roles too, like Abadullah for defense, Abaloni for finance, sort of ministers, and Ababia, who were like regional governors.
It paints a picture of a really organized, quite complex society. Another thing the document discusses is this idea of separating politics and religion and the religious harmony that resulted.
Yes, that's another really interesting point. Apparently, the Gada system kept a clear line between the elected political leaders and the religious leaders, who were called qualus.
Qualus, and they weren't politically appointed.
No, according to the source, their position came from their spiritual calling, personal choice, not politics.
And the result was tolerance.
It seems so. The document really highlights this history of peaceful coexistence among different faiths within the Oromo community. Their traditional belief, Waaqaa, alongside Judaism, Christianity, Islam, living together harmoniously, both historically and today.
That's quite a contrast to what the source describes for some neighboring groups, right? Mentioning histories of religious conflict or discrimination.
Exactly. It positions the Oromo tradition as one of, long-standing religious pluralism, which is quite remarkable for the region and the time.
The source even connects this to those old European legends of Prester John, suggesting Oromo lands might have been seen as that legendary righteous kingdom distinct from what the source calls savage Abyssinians.
It's definitely a different perspective on that historical legend, challenging some common assumptions. Gives you a sense of how maybe some outsiders perceived the Oromo centuries ago.
But, of course, the Gada system eventually declined. What does the source say about why that happened?
Well, it points a finger pretty strongly at European colonial powers. The British, Italians, French. The argument is they armed and supported rival groups, particularly the Amhara and Tigrayans.
So external interference basically destabilized things.
That's the core argument, that this intervention upset the balance of power, led to the Gada system collapsing, and ultimately resulted in the colonization of the Oromo nation, what the source refers to as Ethiopia, in that specific historical context.
It really highlights how external actors can dramatically impact local, indigenous political structures.
Definitely. And the author suggests these historical actions still have consequences today. They even mention more recent U.S. involvement in the region, linking it to ongoing conflicts and instability in the Horn of Africa. It's a critical take.
But there's also a note of hope, isn't there, about Oromo democratic values potentially reemerging.
Yes. The idea seems to be that reviving principles from the Gada system could offer a way forward, a path towards resolving some of these deep-seated conflicts. An optimistic view, grounded in their history.
Okay, let's turn to the religious practices and beliefs themselves. The source draws some really striking parallels.
It really does. What stands out is the comparison between Oromo practices and those described for the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament.
Like what specifically?
Things like worshiping one God, the practice of animal sacrifice, having religious prophets, traditions of worshiping in specific places like mountaintops, near rivers, even having temples.
And the idea is that these traditions were passed down orally because of isolation.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. Due to historical isolation, these traditions were kept alive through oral transmission rather than written text for a long time. But the core belief, the document stresses, is in one God, the creator, the sustainer of everything.
And this is reflected in people's names.
Apparently so. It gives examples like Wakijira, Talasa, Murgasa, Wakitola, names where Waki or similar terms refer to God. It shows how central that belief is.
Wow, woven right into personal identity. And it extends to public life, too.
The source mentions this long-standing tradition where Oromo gatherings, meetings, they always start and end with prayers, giving thanks to God.
Which brings us back to Irreecha. The source describes it as a month-long Thanksgiving holiday.
Yeah, not just a single day, but a whole month. Holding a significance, the author argues, comparable to major Jewish holidays from the Old Testament.
A full month of Thanksgiving. That really emphasizes its cultural weight. Okay, so finally, the document looks towards the future. What's the vision presented there?
It ends with a call to action, really, urging Oromo intellectuals, leaders, political, cultural, religious across the world to set up Oromo cultural development centers.
Why? What's the goal?
The main goal seems to be promoting and preserving Oromo culture, their language, their values, and especially those democratic practices rooted in the Gada system.
So it's about cultural survival and revival.
Exactly. And the ultimate hope, the vision expressed, is for Oromo people to live freely with self-determination under a government based on a rebuilt Gada system, one adapted, of course, for the 21st century.
A future based on reclaiming those historical democratic roots.
Precisely. That's the powerful aspiration it leaves us with. Freedom, autonomy grounded in their own unique heritage.
Okay, so let's try and quickly recap this deep dive. We've looked at Irreecha, this really significant month-long Oromo Thanksgiving, deeply tied to nature, especially the renewal in September.
Right. And we explored the Gada system, their traditional democratic governance, which sounds remarkably sophisticated, with its elections, term limits, separation of powers.
And that interesting emphasis on religious harmony, separating political and religious roles. We also touched on those parallels with ancient traditions and the impact of external forces on the Gada system's decline.
And importantly, that forward-looking vision of reviving those cultural and democratic values.
And remember, this whole discussion came from that source you, our listener, sent in. It's a direct path into understanding this really rich, complex culture.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you to ponder. When you think about these indigenous democratic systems like Gada with such long histories, what insights could their principles, their ways of working, possibly offer us today as we face our own challenges and governance around the world? And, what does the survival of traditions like Irreecha, despite huge historical changes, tell us about just how important cultural preservation is and how resilient these traditions can be?